Okay, so this one I think is going to be quite a big one. It's worth persevering with this one because later in subsequent lessons I'll start to break some of this down into a bit more detail and we'll get into more playing. So this is going to be a bit more theory based, but it's worth sticking with it. So what I want to do is I want to look at all 5 positions of the pentatonic scale going up the neck, and we'll talk about ways of memorizing these shapes as well, and ways of kind of understanding what's going on inside them. But let's start with the 5 positions. So if I lay all the 5 positions out and you have a closer look at them, hopefully you can see, here's the first one. But if you look at the right hand edge of that first position, can you see it's the same shape as the left hand edge of the next position up? And that's because these 2 positions just fit together. So the first one looks like this. And that fits right next to this one. So the right hand edge of the first position contains exactly the same notes as the left hand edge of the second position. And similarly, you can see the left hand edge of the second position fits against the right hand edge of that position fits against the left hand edge of the next position, and going all the way up, we've got the same thing. And then finally, the right hand edge of this last position fits against the left hand edge of the very first one. So you can see everything is in a straight line. And that's because we're now 1 octave up. So instead of thinking of these as shapes in a row, you can almost think of these as just sort of a repeating pattern that goes on and on forever. Okay? So those are the 5 positions that we really need to understand. Now, last time I talked about, when I looked in the first position, I said that there were 2 shapes to have a look for. One was I coloured in green, which looks like this, and the other one I coloured in yellow, which looked like this. Now, what I've done with the next set of shapes is I've taken those first 5 that we've put out, and all I've done is I've highlighted where these yellow and green areas exist in each of the 5 shapes. Now, there's a couple of rules that I've allowed myself to make. One is around the G to B string. You should see that there's something going on. The string shapes individually are the same, but they're kind of offset with each other. And the other thing is, just like in the first position, it went green, then yellow, and then it started the green pattern, but it overlapped. It went off the edge of the guitar. And actually, if I had a 7-string guitar, that second green pattern would have continued on the 7th string, yeah? And that same is true for all of the patterns. But the nice thing is, when you look at each of them, you can see that there is only green and yellow, and you can see they go green, yellow, okay? And actually, if I swap the order around and I move between them, hopefully you can see that here, for example, if I start with a green just on the bottom string, then it goes yellow. Then there's a shape with 2 greens on the bottom, and then yellow. And then there's a shape with a green between the A and the D strings, yeah? And around it it's got yellow. And not surprisingly, between the D and the G string, and yellow around it, yeah? And then similarly between the G and the B string, and this has that offset. Can you see it's got that 1 fret shear in it, but it's still that green shape, and yellow around it. And then we've got green between the B and the E string, yeah? And this is actually the first shape that we encountered. And then we can see the green hanging off the edge. Yeah, and then it completely disappears on a later one. But hopefully you can see these shapes just have these green and yellow patterns just rolling through. Now, what's going on with the G to B string? Now, if you think about how the guitar's tuned, it's tuned on the 5th fret for every pair of strings, yeah? Apart from the G to B, which you tune on the 4th fret, or it's a major 3rd interval. And then you go back to tuning on the 5th fret again, which is a perfect 4th. So there's a weird difference in tuning between the G to B string compared to every other pair of strings going up the neck. And that difference in tuning is the thing that causes that little kink in the shapes, in every shape when we go from the G string to the B string. So that's what's going on. But the important thing for us really is that there's consistency, there's an internal symmetry to each of these pentatonic scale shapes, and that's really what I'm trying to draw your attention to. Now, you could use these shapes to kind of mentally construct in your head. You can kind of calculate from first principles, okay, if I've got a shape that's sort of green across 2 strings, then I can use the yellow shape for 3 strings, because that's a 3-string shape, and then I cycle back to a green shape again. You can kind of mentally construct each of these. But in reality, the way I visualize them, the way I visualize these shapes, is kind of like an idealized version of the first 5 shapes that I showed you. So I kind of just think about the shape of my fingers on the neck. I don't really think about the strings, don't really think about the frets, those are all implied. But each of the shapes in my head are just sort of images of each of the 5 positions, rather than me mentally constructing them on the fly. And I like to think about this as being in the same way as you know your alphabet, the letters of your alphabet. So for example, when I think about the letter capital E, I don't mentally construct, okay, that's got a horizontal line on the top, and it's got a line down the side, and then it's got these other 2 lines as well. The bottom one's longer than the middle one. I don't mentally construct that, I just see a symbol of an E in my mind's eye. And similarly, for each of these 5 positions, I have a mental image of just that first position, so I know straight away what it looks like. And that allows me to sort of jump anywhere on the neck, anywhere across a set of strings, because I'm not mentally calculating them. Okay? Now, there's nothing wrong with using the yellow and the green shapes to kind of help you remember these in the early days. But remember, your goal really is to turn each of these images into, just like you see a letter, you want to see one of these shapes just appearing on the neck, and you know instantly, you can put your fingers, you can jump your hand anywhere across the 6 strings, and you know where to go to play notes from the pentatonic scale. That's your goal. Okay, so why bother with the green and yellow shapes then? Well, they actually bring a little bit more use as well, beyond just trying to memorize the shapes, just trying to construct them. And let me start to show you how we can use them. So just like in the first lesson, all of our 5 shapes can be used across major keys, minor keys, blues keys. Yeah, the difference between them is which note in the shape you use for a root note. Okay, and you use a different root note for them when you use it in a major context to when you use it in a minor or a blues context, just like we covered in the first lesson. So go and recap that if this is confusing to you. Now, the nice thing about these shapes is that when you if you add the root note to these shapes, that root note doesn't change. So if I draw out all of my shapes again with my root notes in place, you can see in the green box, if I'm playing in a major key, my root note is that high note there. So if I'm playing in the key of C major, you can see it lines up with my little finger on the highest string, yeah? And similarly, if I'm playing the second shape, the yellow shape, you can see it lines up with my index finger. And that's true for all of the shapes. If you look at all of the shapes where you see a green shape, you can see it's always that higher note. And where you see a yellow shape, it's all that, always where my index finger falls on the highest string as well. Yeah? And so that gives us a way of kind of orientating each of these shapes going up the neck, which is really kind of powerful. And a really kind of interesting exercise you can do as you're learning these is to just start with your index finger, put your index finger on any string. So I've got it just there, I've got it on the G string. So I know that only happens when I use the yellow shape. And I know above the yellow shape is the green. And so in my head, I know that's the first position of the pentatonic scale. I could put my index finger there on the B string, and I know that's in that position on the yellow shape. So I know what those three strings are, and I know above it is a green. So I know what position I'm playing on the pentatonic, and I can do that anywhere. It's an interesting little experiment. Yeah. Just try putting your index finger on each of the 6 strings and can you build the shape around it. And similarly, you can do the same thing with your little finger. Can you put your little finger anywhere on the neck? Because you know that's that highest note on that green shape. So you know those 2 strings of that green shape, and you know around it is yellow. And that's kind of enough of a sort of a hint to kind of pull the shape out, okay? So that's one of the really useful ways of using the green and the yellow patterns. The other thing about these pentatonic scales that I touched on in the first lesson was that the pentatonic scales have chords hidden in them as well. And actually each of the positions, each of the 5 positions going up the neck have their own chords, their own bar chords hidden in them. So if you remember in that first position, we found a bar G chord, yeah? In the next position up, we have a bar E chord. Yeah, in the next position up, we have a bar D chord. The next position up, we have a bar C chord. And if my fingers will fit, we've got a bar A chord in the next position. And then we've cycled back around to the bar G. And these are really useful, actually. It's useful to learn where the chords are in respect to these scales as well, because these are the root chords of the key that you're playing in. And we'll talk about this in subsequent lessons as well, about how we can use these to improve our solos and to emphasize chord tones. So that's something for later, but it's useful to know about these. The other thing that's useful to be aware of is if you look at the ordering of them, in my case I started with the first position, so the G shape, so I went from G and then E and then D. But if you start from the C shape and look at the letters, you can see they spell letters C, A, G, E, D, or caged. So if you've ever heard of the caged guitar system, this is where it comes from. And that's useful to just have in the back of your mind this C, A, G, E, D, the word caged, because that gives you an ordering of the shapes. If you remember, these shapes just loop around and loop around. If you look at the ordering as you go from C, A is the next one, G is the next one, E is the next one, D is the next one. that kind of helps you to remember what order you use the patterns as you go up the neck. So that's kind of useful, and again we'll talk about this probably in later lessons. Okay, so what about minor keys and blues keys then? Well, as I say, there's a different root note when you're using minor keys, when you're playing it against a minor key or against a blues kind of sound. And that root note, just like we see in the major section, you can identify it in each of the green and the yellow boxes that are highlighted. So in the green box, it's where your index finger falls. If you look at that first position. And in the yellow box, it's the middle string of the group of 3 where your third finger lands. Just there. Yeah, and there as well, okay? And if you have a look at every one of the shapes I've drawn out, you can see, if you know where it is in the green shape and then yellow shape, you can work it out for each of the positions going up the neck, which is really quite powerful. And just like before, you can play exactly the same game. You can set yourself the same task. Just put your index finger anywhere, let's say just there. Okay, I know it's that lower note of the higher string. And I can build the pentatonic scale for that position. So just try putting your index finger on each of the 6 strings and see if you can build it. And similarly, see if you can put your third finger on each of the 6 strings and see if you can build that. Yeah? So just there. By knowing that I want to make that the root note. Okay? So give that a go. And just like before, for each of these positions, when you're thinking about it in a minor context, there are minor chords that are hidden inside each of these positions. So you can see in the first one, the minor chord is a bar E minor shape. Yeah, it's that E minor shape turned into a bar chord. In the next position, it's a bar D minor shape. In the next position, it's a bar C minor shape. Now, this is a really ugly chord to try and play. You can kind of play parts of it. But the point is really, all this is doing is highlighting important notes in that shape. Yeah? Which is just there. And in the next position, it's just here, it's a bar A minor shape. Yeah. And then finally we have a bar G minor shape. Again, this is an ugly thing to have to try and play, but it's really, you're not really trying to play chords when you're improvising, you're just using this. You're just using this as a way of sort of anchoring your visualization so you know where the important notes are in that pentatonic scale. So that's all we're using these chords for. But as I say, I'll talk about this in more detail later on. Okay, so exercises. Now, the exercises this week are going to be pretty much based on what we did last week. But all we're going to do is we're going to pick each of the other positions going up the neck and you're going to do the same kind of a thing. So if you start with the second position, for example, which looks like this. Where are the root notes? So if I visualize that, I know I've got a major root note there, which I know is the topmost note, or you know, the left-hand edge of that yellow position, yeah, yellow shape. And I know I've got another root there, which is the topmost note of that pair of strings in that green shape, and then right on the bass, it's the start of that yellow shape, so there's my root. So can you find the roots? Can you find the minor roots? Can you start to play around with the shape itself, can you start to inject some of your personality, like we talked about last week? Can you put some vibrato on each of the notes? Can you do slides? How about string bends? Can you do string bends on each of the notes as well? And then finally, don't forget the 3 jam tracks that I put a link to below. Use those by all means, find your own jam tracks by all means, but just explore the shape against the harmony. Just let the harmony wash over you and listen to each of the notes in the position that you're looking at. And just see if you can find the notes, find out what sounds good to you. Just start playing around with the shape. And that's it. As I say, it's a big one this week. There's a lot to cover this week, but in the subsequent lessons, we're going to start breaking some of this down and use it to create some more music. So we'll chat then. Goodbye.